Trying to uncover the truth can be a noble endeavor, but it can often put an investigator's life at risk. These people may have paid the ultimate price for revealing secrets. Number 10. At about 9 p.m. on July 9, 2004, journalist Paul Klebnikov was leaving his office when someone opened fire on him. He was struck by 4 bullets, and even though he initially survived the attack, he passed away in the hospital later that night. He was the first American journalist to lose his life in Russia in such a brutal attack, and his case sent shockwaves around the world, and it remains unsolved. Paul was born in the US to a Russian family who'd fled the Bolshevik Revolution. He felt a close tie with his heritage and studied Russian and economics at school. After the fall of the Soviet Union, he was optimistic about Russia's future. But that didn't stop him from writing critical articles when he saw corruption and injustice. In 1989, he joined Forbes and became known for his expertise and investigations into the economic dealings of Eastern Europe. He traveled to Russia to research 2 books. The first was about the Russian tycoon Boris Berezovsky. Berezovsky had been a government official and was one of the people who became very wealthy after the fall of the Soviet Union. Not all of his business dealings were considered to be above the board, and Paul's book compared him to the Sicilian mafia. When Paul's articles on the man appeared in Forbes, Berezovsky sued the magazine for libel. The magazine settled, but Paul backed his claims, later publishing a book on them. His second book was on the Chechen rebel leader, Koz Ahmed Nukayev, which provides a unique insight into a man who's also been described as a gangster. When Forbes decided to launch a new magazine in Russia, Paul was considered the best man for the job. He still remained hopeful about Russia's future, but wanted to hold people accountable. The first issue of the Russian Forbes featured a list of the 100 wealthiest Russians and how they earned their wealth. While making the Forbes richest list is considered a positive achievement for many in the West, the Russian billionaires did not like the magazine revealing just how wealthy they were, at a time when other people lived in poverty. In 2004, Paul was working on his 3rd book. This book would again focus on Berezovsky, who's been described as Paul's #1 enemy. Paul had evidence of links between Berezovsky and the criminal organizations in Chechnya. The book would never be published, and details of Paul's investigations have never come to light. When Paul left the office on the last day of his life, witnesses saw someone fire a weapon from a slow-moving car. He was rushed to the hospital after the attack, living, even though the ambulance that carried him didn't have any oxygen tanks. At the hospital, he was taken into an elevator that then malfunctioned, and he never made it into any operation. An investigation into the attack began immediately, but Paul's friends and family may have been critical of the police response. Russian investigators believe the hit was ordered by Nukayev. Nukayev vanished without a trace around the same time and hasn't been seen since. It's presumed he's no longer alive now, and may have actually lost his own life before Paul. Number 9. Sunil Upadhyay was a heritage conservation scientist at the biggest museum in India. It would have been an exciting job, but it may have ultimately been the cause of his disappearance. In 2014, the Indian Museum was rocked by a scandal when artifacts it provided for an exhibition were proven to be fake. It was one of the many similar scandals that had affected the museum in recent years. The museum was home to countless artifacts, but there wasn't enough room for everything to go on display. Most artifacts were stored out of public view in the museum's basement. Later investigations alleged it would be relatively simple to smuggle artifacts out of the museum. Some parts of the museum didn't have any cameras, and those cameras that were present only ran when the museum was open. There were also discrepancies within the museum's financial workings, and there wasn't one clear, transparent way for the museum to acquire artifacts. That only made it even easier for items to go missing without ever being noticed. Sunil's family describe him as a whistleblower. He'd spoken out about problems within the museum and raised the issues within and outside the organization. He was described as a crusader against corruption. Sunil wanted to do something about the problems within the museum, that were allowing corrupt individuals to steal important items of Indian heritage and pass them on to foreign auction houses. When a position as deputy director became open, Sunil applied. He was allegedly pressured to withdraw his application, but it's not clear if this actually worked. All this was going on when Sunil disappeared on July 3, 2014. Sunil lived in Calcutta with his cousin and his cousin's wife. At about 6 p.m., he told his cousin he was going on an evening walk to a nearby lake. When he didn't, his cousin alerted the authorities. Sunil had left behind most of his belongings, including his passport and phone. He left a book on mindfulness open next to his bed, and it looked like he intended to return quickly. Sunil was in ill health when he vanished. When the rest of his family learned of his disappearance, they believed this might have been the reason. They had no idea about the office politics that had caused Sunil so many problems. Searches of local hospitals unfortunately turned up no answers. What initially started as a missing person investigation soon became a kidnapping case. Sunil's family believed his status as a whistleblower had caused too many problems, and someone had taken drastic measures to silence him. The people smuggling artifacts out of the museum wouldn't have been working alone. This was the work of criminal organizations. Building work at the museum was also allegedly connected to the mafia. If someone involved in the corruption at the museum had wanted to remove Sunil, they would have been able to find criminals capable of kidnapping. Sunil's family tried to keep pressure on the authorities to get to the bottom of his disappearance. The case was taken to the Supreme Court when they felt the local authorities weren't doing enough to find their loved one. Unfortunately, no clues that could point to an explanation in the case have ever been uncovered. After a flurry of newspaper coverage early in the investigation, there's been little coverage in the decade since Sunil vanished, and he remains missing. Number 8. Michael Hastings was an American journalist who lost his life in a car accident in 2013. Shortly before he passed away, he'd emailed coworkers to say he needed to go off the radar while working on a story, and he'd attracted the attention of the FBI. While the investigation into the crash confirmed it was an accident, many think there might be more to the story. Michael had made a name for himself as a writer who wouldn't keep quiet in order to maintain access to high-profile officials. He didn't like the culture in political journalism, where writers would paint their subjects in a flattering light to make sure the figure would respond to them in the future. He told the truth, writing things that others might have considered off the record if he thought his audience needed to hear about them. This most famously occurred in 2010 when the Rolling Stone magazine published a profile on U.S. Army General Stanley McChrystal. McChrystal was the commander of NATO forces in Afghanistan at the time, and Michael had the chance to get exclusive access to this important figure. The access was supposed to be closely monitored, but when the eruption of an Icelandic volcano grounded all flights, Michael was allowed to join McChrystal and other soldiers on a bus ride to their destination. During that time, unflattering comments about the civilian army command were made. While some journalists might have kept quiet on this to make sure they could interview McChrystal again in the future, Michael published a detailed report of the event. It ended with McChrystal being removed from power by President Barack Obama. Michael claimed he didn't believe his reporting would have such an impact, but he didn't shy away from this style of reporting in the future. Michael had moved his focus back to the US, where he was increasingly concerned about the government's monitoring of journalists and what he saw as restrictions on press freedom. He also reported on the monitoring of Occupy Wall Street protesters. In February of 2012, he released an internal document from the US Department of Homeland Security about the monitoring and criticized the government's handling of the protests. In 2013, Michael was working on another profile for Rolling Stones, and this time the subject was CIA Director John Brennan. But this profile would never be produced. By June, he had started to behave erratically. He'd never worried about the consequences of his reporting before, but now he believed he was being monitored. He thought more helicopters were flying overhead than usual, and worried that he couldn't be open when talking to coworkers over the phone. On the 17th, he sent a strange email to his employers at BuzzFeed and to WikiLeaks. He said he was being monitored by the FBI, and they were contacting people who knew him. He claimed to be working on a big story, but needed to go off the radar for a while. Michael's family were concerned about his mental health, and his brother traveled to Los Angeles to try to get him to seek treatment, but he refused. In the early hours of June 18th, he snuck out of his house and got into his car. The car was spotted speeding through red lights and down Los Angeles streets. At roughly 4:20 a.m., it jumped across the median and hit a tree. The car was going so fast that there was no way Michael could survive. An investigation found there was no evidence for foul play, and Michael's family believed the accident lines up with the erratic behavior. But some believe Michael's car may have been tampered with or even hacked, resulting in the tragic accident. Number 7. Sherri Malarik was last seen alive on September 21st, 2001. The next day, her brother-in-law found her body in the family minivan. It would take decades before anyone stood trial in this case, and an acquittal means the case remains unsolved to this day. Sherri was last seen at her home in Cantonment, Florida, where she lived with her husband and their children. Sherri and her husband Greg had married 7 years earlier. Both had children from previous relationships and went on to have 3 more children after they married. The house was extremely busy on the night of September 21st. As well as their own children, the Malariks were hosting a sleepover with the children's cousins. The children had just sat down for dinner when Sherri stepped outside. According to her niece, Greg had called her outside, where she was working on the family van. A short while later, Greg came inside. When asked, he told the children Sherri had gone to the store to buy milk. He went for a shower, and the children continued their sleepover. By 11 p.m., Greg began to worry about his wife. He called his sister Tina to see if she'd heard from Sherri, and she hadn't. When Sherri still hadn't returned home the next morning, Tina's husband went out to look for her. He drove around the local area before stumbling across Sherri's van in a grocery store parking lot. It was parked towards the back of the lot in an isolated area. When he looked inside, he spotted Sherri on the floor of the van. It looked as if she'd been pushed down onto the floorboards to try to hide her. It was a gruesome crime scene, and Tina's husband quickly realized Sherri wasn't alive. Shortly before her disappearance, Sherri had shared a secret with her sister. Both Greg and Sherri were in the military, and they'd actually met on deployment. Sherri had recently returned from a year-long deployment in Greece, where she worked as a Navy air traffic controller. When she came back, her young daughter asked her why her father didn't love Sherri anymore. She revealed that Greg was apparently in love with a woman named Jennifer. Jennifer Spohn was another woman Greg had met at work, who sometimes babysat for him while Sherri was away. They'd been having an affair while Sherri was on deployment. Sherri told her sister she wanted to continue working on their marriage and didn't want to break up the family. It wasn't long until the police learned of this affair. Greg actually brought up Jennifer himself, unprompted. On the night of Sherri's disappearance, Jennifer had stopped by to drop off a lawnmower she had borrowed. The police found the story strange, but the children were able to confirm it. Years passed, and there was little progress on the case. The police believed Sherri had actually been attacked in her vehicle, but there was nothing at the parking lot to suggest the crime had actually taken place there. Sherri had been attacked, and then the vehicle was moved. They also believed that it had been a targeted attack, rather than a random robbery. Unfortunately, forensic examination of the van and the Malarik house didn't turn up any more clues. It wasn't until Jennifer finally provided more information that the police were able to arrest Greg. Jennifer claimed to have picked up Greg from the same parking lot where his wife's body was found on the night of the disappearance. She dropped him off at home, then waited a few moments before knocking on the door to return the lawnmower. He gave her a bag of clothes and a weapon, telling her to get rid of them. These items have never been found. Greg stood trial for the crime, and he allegedly told Jennifer that taking Sherri's life would be easier than getting a divorce. But Greg insisted he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance or passing, and after 2 trials, he was found not guilty. Number 6. Hazel Crane lived an exciting and eventful life, and had more than one secret that would be revealed in a tell-all memoir that she was working on. But before that book was published, her life was brutally cut short. It was November 10th, 2003. Crane was living in South Africa, where she'd made a home for herself after moving across the world from Northern Ireland. She could often be found at parties with high society figures and was good friends with Winnie Mandela. Crane had married 4 times, the last of which was to an Israeli diamond dealer named Shai Avissar. It was a whirlwind romance, and Avissar's alleged ties to the Israeli mafia didn't seem to bother Crane too much. She had her own criminal history and had been convicted once for smuggling diamonds. A bigger problem for Crane was the fact that her husband was having an affair and planned to take half her fortune when he left her. They divorced, but Crane still cared about Avissar. When he disappeared in 1999, she was one of the biggest advocates trying to solve his case. Crane had a suspect in mind, Lior Sat, another alleged member of the Israeli mafia. She wasn't afraid to confront him about her suspicions, posting a flyer asking for information on the windscreen of her car while he was sitting inside. Sat allegedly got out and pointed a weapon at her, threatening to take her life. Crane would eventually come into contact with the man, who claimed he'd been one of the people who had attacked Avissar. The police were taken to the location where Avissar had been buried in a shallow grave. Sat was arrested, and Crane became one of the key witnesses. It was clear Crane's life was in danger. She'd already dodged one attempt on her life by November of 2003. Other witnesses in the case had also lost their lives, including the gravedigger who'd come forward with information. Crane had hired a bodyguard, but he wasn't with her on November 10th, when she drove with a friend to the courthouse to watch Sat's trial. As they waited at an intersection, a man jumped out from behind a dustbin and opened fire on Crane's car. She was struck multiple times and rushed to the hospital. Unfortunately, nothing could be done, and she passed away 3 hours later. Her friend was also wounded but survived. Not long after Crane's passing, the lead investigator on the case also passed away, though this time from natural causes. The case against Sat fell apart, and he was free to leave the country. It was clearly a targeted hit, and Sat, or people working with him, became the prime suspects, but without any direct evidence, the authorities were unable to charge him in relation to the case. Number 5. Rajinder Singh became known in India as the spy who disappeared. He vanished in May of 2004 when he fled to the United States after leaking secrets to the CIA for years. Singh left behind a few pieces of evidence, but his story remains mostly a mystery. Singh had been in India's Research and Analysis Wing for decades before his disappearance. The agency is India's foreign intelligence agency, which gathers foreign intelligence and counterintelligence. It's also responsible for the security of India's nuclear weapons program. After decades of service, Singh had risen to a relatively high rank within the organization, but according to some sources, he wanted more money. Around 1992, his daughter allegedly had a medical issue, and Singh wanted a better job so he could pay for her medical bills. He suggested being sent to Washington, but he was instead posted as a counselor in the Netherlands. It's believed to be sometime around this point that Singh was first approached by the CIA. As Singh was never caught, and he didn't publish any memoir himself, the details of his defection remain a mystery. Some theories are that he was the victim of a honey trap, being persuaded to join the CIA by a female agent, or that he simply wanted better money. He seemed to live beyond the means that his job at the RAW would provide, suggesting money may have been a motive. According to Indian reports, he was specially trained by the CIA to pass on information without meeting his handler. Despite later investigations, he was never actually caught on camera meeting anyone from the CIA. It was after he returned to India that he was most useful to the CIA. Exactly why the American embassy wanted to spy on India's intelligence agency is a mystery. One possibility is that it had something to do with India's nuclear weapons program. The US may have wanted information gathered about India's neighbor, Pakistan. According to Indian officials, Singh didn't actually pass on anything of critical intelligence, but he did photocopy countless reports, often from departments that had nothing to do with his own work, which are believed to have found their way into the hands of the CIA. Singh's interest in other departments, as well as his spending, attracted attention. Microphones and cameras were placed in his office, but the agents watching him were never able to capture enough evidence to make an arrest. Singh was eventually tipped off about the observation, and he fled to Nepal with his wife. In Nepal, he met CIA agent David Vakala. Vakala provided Singh and his wife with new passports and plane tickets to the United States. What happened after this point is mostly a mystery. Now in the United States, Singh didn't provide much use to the CIA, and he was let go. It's believed he may have applied for asylum in the US, although this seems to have been rejected. He stayed in the US anyway, and according to reports, he lost his life in a car accident in 2016. Number 4. Alexander Perepilichnyy was a Russian businessman who revealed secrets about a tax fraud scheme shortly before he suddenly passed away in 2012. Even though an official inquest found he'd likely passed from natural causes, some investigators of the case believe there was more to Alexander's case than at first it seemed. Alexander realized his talents as a businessman while he was studying sciences at university. As the financial systems in Russia changed, Alexander took advantage of new opportunities. He was particularly talented at helping other people make money with investments, multiplying whatever he was given to invest. One of the people he worked with was Vladlen Stepanov. But during the 2008 financial crisis, Alexander lost money for Stepanov, and Stepanov accused him of theft. In 2009, Alexander left Russia and eventually ended up moving to England. According to his wife, Alexander had not fled Russia, but they'd moved to England to provide their children with a better education. It had nothing to do with the falling out of the Stepanovs or with a tax fraud case he would soon reveal the truth about. In August of 2010, he contacted Bill Browder. Browder was an American businessman who'd made money in Russia around the same time Alexander had. He'd originally been a defender of Vladimir Putin, but eventually grew too big for the Russian president and was blacklisted from the country. Most of his businesses were wound down, but while he was still abroad, those that remained were raided. Important documents were seized, and new ones were created, transferring ownership of the businesses. Documents were forged to say that the businesses had considerable debts, which would make them eligible for a tax refund. Refunds worth $230 million were granted by the Russian tax office and the specific offices that Olga Stepanova worked at. Once granted, the money was transferred through various overseas bank accounts, including at least one owned by Alexander. After falling out with the Stepanovs, Alexander brought information about the fraud to Browder. He'd been trying to investigate it himself for years, but had gotten nowhere. Now he had proof, but information that was made public revealed that Alexander was behind the leak. Alexander had allegedly received threats and appeared on a list of enemies in Moscow, but according to his wife, he wasn't worried about his safety. They lived in a secure, gated community in Surrey. Alexander had a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy, which came into effect just a few days before he passed away. Alexander woke on November 10, 2012 in Paris, where he was on a weekend getaway with a girlfriend. The night before, he'd felt ill after eating seafood, but was feeling better and ate that morning. He traveled back to the UK by train and ate soup prepared by his wife in the afternoon. Around 5 p.m., he went out jogging, and he was in relatively good health but was trying to lose weight. As he jogged around the secured, gated community, he collapsed. Onlookers tried to perform CPR, but the businessman passed away in the ambulance. Initially, police believed there was nothing suspicious about the case. The scene was not secure, and the contents of Alexander's stomach weren't analyzed until long after most traces of poisons would have faded. But Bill Browder was certain the whistleblower had met with foul play. An inquest into his passing began, but was delayed several times as more information came to light. When the investigators requested information from government secret services, the inquest was delayed further, as some information was considered so important for national security that even the coroner couldn't see it. Despite this, the possibility that a compound associated with the poison was found in Alexander's stomach, the coroner found it was most likely that Alexander passed from natural causes, although the exact cause remained unknown. Number 3. Patricia Webb's family remembered her as a responsible teenager who'd grown into a young woman who was still looking for her place in life. That search had taken her into some dangerous work, which may have cost her her life when she was only 24 years old. Patricia grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, and was raised by her uncle and his wife after her mother passed away. They saw her as their daughter, and they were a very close family. As an adult, Patricia enrolled in university twice but dropped out, and was still trying to figure out what she was going to do with her life. In early 1974, she began working at the adult book and cinema store, which would sometimes involve working overnight. The store had opened 2 years earlier and wasn't popular with the residents. They tried to stop it from opening, and even after the owner was granted court permission for the store to move ahead, it continued to face problems. Many thought that it had ties to organized crime and illegal substances, although it's unclear whether there's any truth to these rumors. Patricia went to work as usual on the night of April 18th. When her coworkers arrived the following morning, they found the store empty, but the front doors were unlocked. Around 50 magazines were missing, as well as a calculator, and $30 had been taken from the cash register. The theft would have been extremely out of character for Patricia, but the fact that she was nowhere to be found made her a person of interest in the case. 2 days later, the police realized this wasn't a simple theft case. A farmer had brought his cows to graze on a farm east of Hallam, about a 30-minute drive from the store, and he spotted a leg poking out from a haystack and uncovered it to reveal the remains of Patricia Webb. Patricia had been struck by 10 bullets from 2 different weapons, and there was tape over her mouth when her body was discovered. She was only wearing a quilt jacket that did not belong to her. The jacket originated from a local feed company, which produced them for staff members and some customers. Only 147 items of size were produced. The police knew it was unlikely this was a robbery gone wrong, and they believed Patricia had been deliberately targeted. It would soon emerge that Patricia had been working as a police informant. The work had begun about a year earlier, and she'd helped set up busts that would help catch dozens of people involved in the trade of illegal substances. Just the day after she disappeared, she was due to appear in court as a witness in a number of cases. The cases she was due to testify in were relatively small. The police didn't believe the crimes would warrant such a violent attack just to stop the associated criminals from being put behind bars. But all the cases she was due to testify in had to be dropped without her as a witness. Number 2. Alfredo Jimenez Mota was a Mexican journalist who vanished without a trace in April of 2005. Friends and family have urged the government to find answers in his disappearance, which they believe was related to his work as an investigative reporter. Jimenez Mota lived and grew up in Hermosillo, the capital of the northern Mexican state of Sonora. He'd studied communications at university and started working on local papers while he was still a student. After graduating, he became focused on the Nota Roja genre, a popular type of journalism that features tabloid-style crime stories. It wouldn't be difficult for Jimenez Mota to find such stories, with organized crime involving the movement of illegal substances becoming a serious problem in the local area. About 5 months before he vanished, Jimenez Mota began working for El Imparcial, a newspaper based in Hermosillo. He continued to cover crime stories, but didn't only provide surface-level coverage of the crimes. He wanted to dive deeper, providing answers about what was really happening and why. The newspaper knew of some of his reports, and they would put his life at risk, and they didn't want to include his name in the byline, but Jimenez Mota insisted. At the time of his disappearance, Jimenez Mota was investigating a connection between the criminal organizations and the government. This would put him in more danger than ever before, and he'd actually received threats against his life before his disappearance. Jimenez Mota was cautious, but he wouldn't give up his goal of uncovering the truth. He was last seen on April 2nd, 2004. He had plans to meet up with his coworkers at a bar that evening, but told them that he was going to meet a source first. The source was apparently getting nervous. At the time, the source's identity was a mystery, but it would later emerge that he'd gone to meet Andre Montoya, then Deputy Director General of the State Penitentiary System of Sonora. According to Montoya, they met in a supermarket, although what they discussed is unknown. He claimed Jimenez Mota was in good health when they parted ways, and he believed the journalist was going to meet another source. That evening, he failed to meet up for drinks. The following day was a Sunday, and it wouldn't be until Monday that anybody realized he was missing. On Tuesday morning, when Montoya still didn't show up for work, the newspaper contacted his parents to see what was going on, and it was only then that he was reported missing. Over 20 years, there's been very little development in his case, and no arrests have ever been made. Number 1. In post-communist Poland, there's only one case of a disappearance of a journalist that's been connected to their work. This is the case of Jaroslaw Zietara. Zietara was 23 years old at the time of his disappearance, but he'd already begun to make a name for himself as an investigative reporter in Poland. He'd studied political science and journalism and worked for a variety of newspapers before joining a daily newspaper that was privatized in 1990. Communism came to an end in Poland in 1989, leading to a lot of privatization. Some citizens used the new economic system to become very rich, but not everyone who did so became rich legally. Organized crime and corruption were both major issues. Zietara's work involved looking into these economic scandals and uncovering the truth behind murky business dealings. His work put him in touch with some important people. Zietara is believed to have had contacts with the Office of State Protection, or UOP, Poland's security office. But he also made enemies of the people who would feature in his stories. If he was particularly worried about these enemies at the time of his disappearance, it wasn't something his friends and family knew about. September 1st, 1992, started like any other day. Zietara lived in Poznan with his girlfriend. They ate breakfast together, and at around 8:40 a.m., Zietara left for work. The newspaper office was only around a 30-minute walk away. Zietara's girlfriend was out of the house that day, and when she came home in the afternoon, Zietara wasn't back yet. She went straight to bed as she wasn't feeling well. When she woke up the following morning, there was still no sign of Zietara. At this point, she began to worry. She contacted the newspaper office to see if something had happened the day before. It was only then that she discovered Zietara had never made it to the office. It wasn't unusual for journalists not to spend every day at the office. His co-workers had assumed Zietara was out, chasing up on a story, so they weren't worried when he didn't come in. But now it looked like something was very wrong. Zietara was reported missing, but initially his disappearance wasn't taken seriously by the authorities. It wasn't until 1993 that a significant investigation into his disappearance began. It was theorized that Zietara may have intentionally disappeared. Some believed that he'd become a spy and gone abroad. Around 4 months before his disappearance, he made a note in his diary to reply to the UOP, and according to some sources, he'd been offered a job there, which he turned down. It was theorized that he actually hadn't turned this job down, though, but Zietara left behind documents that had likely come from the Secret Service, something he would have at least destroyed if he was going to join the organization. Eventually, a former security officer who put Zietara under surveillance came forward with information. He claimed to have seen Zietara being forced into a car by men dressed as police officers. He'd been kidnapped. The prime suspect in this case was Alexander Goronek, one of the richest men in Poland at the time of Zietara's disappearance. He'd made a lot of money after the change of economic system and would later be arrested for customs and tax fraud. He'd been the subject of Zietara's investigations and one of the people who'd benefited from silencing the journalist. People with connections to Goronek implicated him and his bodyguards in Zietara's disappearance. He was arrested but found not guilty. Zietara has never been found, and his case remains unsolved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.